The final courtroom hearing felt completely different from everything before it, quiet, heavy, and final. As if the entire room was holding its breath waiting for something irreversible to be spoken aloud. The judge reviewed the full trust structure, all amendments, and every piece of testimony from everyone involved, including attorney Richard Hale, whose voice finally broke when he admitted he had given Melissa misleading interpretations about the trust, not based on legal truth, but based on what she wanted to believe. As each layer of the truth unfolded, it became painfully clear that Melissa had built her entire case on assumptions and false expectations, convinced she could secure inheritance through divorce. While in reality, the trust had strict protective conditions that activated only when coordinated emotional and financial influence was detected within the family. Ethan, who had spent the entire process caught between loyalty and confusion, slowly began to understand that he had not been making fully informed choices, but had instead been guided through half-truths he never questioned deeply enough. And for the first time, the certainty he once held completely collapsed into silence and regret. The judge then delivered the final ruling in a calm, controlled voice that changed everything in an instant. The trust conditions had been officially triggered, meaning it would not be distributed to any individual family member at all, but instead transferred into an independent, court-supervised protection foundation designed to permanently remove personal control and prevent any form of manipulation in the future. In that moment, everything Melissa had been chasing disappeared in a single sentence, not through anger or punishment, but through structure and truth that could not be argued against. Outside the courthouse, the emotional weight finally settled in real time. Melissa stood still for a long moment, her confidence completely gone, and for the first time she admitted in a quiet voice that she had been chasing a future that was never truly real. Ethan remained silent beside her, struggling to process everything he had learned, slowly accepting that he had been misled and used in ways he never intended. And that realization broke something inside him, not loudly but deeply and permanently. As I stood there watching everything settle, I finally understood what this entire journey had really been about. It was never about winning a divorce case, never about money, and never even about the trust itself. It was about truth, slow, uncomfortable, unavoidable truth, finally exposing every hidden intention that had been buried under fear, belief, and manipulation. My mother's letter echoed in my mind one last time, reminding me that people do not change because of wealth. They reveal who they truly are when pressure removes every mask they wear. And in the end, that was exactly what had happened here. Truth did not punish anyone, it did not reward anyone, it simply revealed everything exactly as it was. And once that truth was fully seen, there was nothing left to fight for anymore, except understanding, acceptance, and the quiet realization that sometimes the end of a story is not victory or defeat, but clarity. And in that silence outside the courthouse, clarity didn't arrive as something powerful or dramatic. It came slowly, almost gently, like the weight of everything finally settling into place. I looked around and saw faces that once felt like enemies, now just people. People who had been driven by fear, assumptions, influence, and the stories they chose to believe when truth felt too distant to reach. Melissa stood a few steps away, no longer carrying the same certainty that once defined her decisions. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, only the exhaustion of someone who finally realized that the future she had been chasing was built on something she never truly understood. Ethan didn't look at anyone for a long time. He just stood there, processing everything in silence, as if every belief he held had been carefully taken apart and placed back in front of him in a different order, forcing him to see it for what it really was. And for me, there was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction of winning something over someone else. Instead, there was a strange stillness, a feeling that the storm had not made me stronger, but simply more aware of what was real and what was never meant to last. My mother's words didn't feel like a memory anymore. They felt like a final lesson that had been waiting years to be understood. People don't change because of wealth. They reveal who they are when everything else is stripped away. And now, standing in the aftermath of everything, I finally understood what she meant. Not as advice, not as warning, but as truth that only life itself can teach. As the sky began to dim and the courthouse slowly emptied, there was no celebration, no confrontation, no final moment of revenge or reward. Just distance, just time. Just the quiet understanding that some battles don't end with winners and losers. They end with people walking away carrying different versions of the same truth. And in that truth, painful as it was, there was something unexpected: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing else needed to be proven anymore. And in that truth, painful as it was, there was something unexpected: peace. Not because everything was fixed, not because anyone had truly won or lost in a traditional sense, but because the need to keep proving anything had finally disappeared. For so long, every conversation, every hearing, every document, and every silence had felt like part of a battle where something always had to be defended, explained, or exposed. But now, standing in the aftermath of it all, that pressure was simply gone. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to convince, and nothing left to fight against. I remember standing there for a long moment, just watching the courthouse doors slowly close as people drifted away into their own versions of this story. Melissa didn't look back. Ethan paused once, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, then quietly walked away beside her, carrying his own weight of understanding in silence. And I didn't stop him. Because sometimes, holding on to people after the truth is revealed doesn't heal anything. It only delays acceptance. The air outside felt different, almost unfamiliar, like I had stepped out of something much heavier than a legal case. It wasn't relief exactly, it was emptiness mixed with clarity. The kind of emptiness that doesn't hurt the same way anymore, because it no longer expects anything from the past. I realized then that for months, maybe even years, I had been waiting for an outcome, waiting for a moment where everything would finally make sense, where justice or explanation would bring closure. But closure doesn't arrive like a verdict, it arrives like silence, slow, unassuming, almost invisible at first. And in that silence, I finally understood what my mother had tried to prepare me for all along. Not a victory, not a loss. But the moment when you stop needing the story to continue in your favor, in order to accept that it has already ended. Because once truth is fully revealed, it doesn't ask you to celebrate or suffer. It simply asks you to let go of the version of reality you were holding on to. So I stood there a little longer, breathing in that quiet, letting it settle into me. Not as an ending that defined me, but as one that released me. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was inside a fight anymore. That realization didn't arrive like a sudden relief. It came slowly, almost cautiously, like my mind didn't fully trust peace after being in conflict for so long. For so many months, my thoughts had been shaped by tension: what happens next, what will be exposed, who will betray whom, what truth is still hidden. My life had become a chain of reactions. Every moment demanded a response. Every silence felt suspicious. Every conversation carried weight. But now there was nothing left to respond to, no next argument waiting behind the corner. No hidden document that would suddenly change everything again. No voice telling me I needed to prepare for another battle. Just silence. And in that silence, I began to notice something I had forgotten how to feel. Time, not time as pressure, but time as presence. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. I remember slowly walking away from the courthouse steps, not because I had a destination, but because standing still felt unfamiliar. Each step forward didn't feel like escape. It felt like separation from everything that had defined my life for so long. Even the air felt lighter, as if it no longer carried the weight of other people's intentions. But my mind wasn't empty. It was replaying everything. Melissa's face when truth finally removed her certainty. Ethan's silence when he realized he had been standing inside a version of events he never fully understood. The judge's final words: cold, structured, final. And my mother's letter, the way it didn't accuse anyone, didn't defend anyone, but simply revealed how truth always waits patiently for the right moment. I stopped walking for a moment and looked back at the building. The courthouse didn't look like a place of justice anymore. It looked like a place where illusions end. Where people come carrying versions of truth they believe are real and leave carrying the actual one. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had defeated anyone. That realization surprised me. Because I had spent so long thinking this story would end with clarity through victory. That someone would win, someone would lose, and that would create closure. But standing there, I understood something different. There was no victory in watching people realize their own truth. There was only understanding and acceptance and distance. A quiet distance that forms when life no longer needs to be corrected. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. For months, my body had been in a constant state of tension without me even noticing it. My shoulders always slightly raised, my thoughts always slightly ahead of the present. My emotions always preparing for impact. But now, for the first time, there was no impact left to prepare for, and strangely, that felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just new. As I walked further down the street, I noticed small things I hadn't paid attention to in a long time. People talking without urgency. A child laughing somewhere in the distance. The sound of traffic that no longer felt like interruption, but just life continuing on its own path. It made me realize something deeper. While I was trapped inside this storm of betrayal, truth, and revelation, the world had never stopped moving. Life had never paused for my conflict. It had simply continued, waiting for me to step back into it when I was ready. And now maybe I was, but not as the same person who entered the fight, because something inside me had changed. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way I could explain easily, but in a quiet restructuring of how I saw people and how I saw myself. I no longer believed that every action needed an enemy behind it. I no longer believed that every mistake required punishment to feel complete, and I no longer believed that closure had to come from confrontation. Sometimes closure is just understanding that the story no longer controls you. I reached a small bench near the road and sat down. For a long time I just stayed there. No phone, no calls. No thoughts about what comes next. Just silence sitting beside me like an old friend I had forgotten. And in that silence I finally understood my mother's intention fully. She hadn't designed everything to protect wealth. She had designed it to force truth into visibility. Not instantly, not violently, but inevitably. Because truth, when left long enough, always rises to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried under belief, manipulation, or misunderstanding. And once it rises, it changes everything without needing to destroy anything. I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about fixing anything. I wasn't thinking about what I should have said differently, or what I should have seen earlier, or how I could have prevented it all. Those thoughts, they were gone, not erased. Just no longer important, because the story had already completed its purpose. It had revealed what it needed to reveal, and now it was finished, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. And in that completion, I finally felt what I had been chasing all along without realizing it. Not revenge, not justice, not victory, but release. The kind that doesn't ask for acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't need anyone else to understand it. The kind that simply exists when you stop resisting what already is. I opened my eyes slowly. The sky above looked the same as it always had. But I didn't, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was inside a fight anymore. I felt like I had finally stepped out of the story that once defined me, and returned to the life that had been waiting for me all along. Felt like I had finally stepped out of the story that once defined me, and returned to the life that had been waiting for me all along. But even as that thought settled inside me, I realized something unexpected. Returning didn't feel like going back. It felt like arriving somewhere I had never truly been before. Because the life I was stepping into now wasn't the same one I had left behind when all of this began. It had changed, and more importantly, I had changed. I sat there on the bench for a while longer, watching the world move without me needing to be part of its conflict. Cars passed, people walked by. Conversations happened in fragments I didn't need to complete anymore. Everything felt ordinary, but in that ordinariness, I found something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Stillness without tension, not emptiness, not loneliness, just space. Space to exist without reacting. For months, maybe longer than I even realized, my life had been measured in problems. Every day had been a response to something: legal meetings, emotional confrontations, hidden truths, unexpected revelations. Even silence had felt like a warning. But now silence had changed its meaning. It wasn't hiding something anymore, it was simply silence. And that difference changed everything. I slowly stood up from the bench, not because I had somewhere urgent to go, but because I felt ready to move without being pulled by pressure. My steps were slower than before, not weak, just aware. Aware of the ground beneath me, aware of the fact that I didn't need to rush toward resolution anymore. As I walked down the street, my thoughts drifted, not to the courtroom, not to Melissa, not to Ethan, but to something deeper: time. How strange it is that time keeps moving even when your world collapses. And how strange it is that you only notice its movement when the collapse finally ends. I passed by a small cafe on the corner. Nothing special about it, but something about the warm light inside made me stop. I stood outside for a moment, just looking in through the glass. People were sitting inside, talking, laughing, living normal moments that didn't carry legal weight or emotional consequence. No one inside knew anything about trusts, court rulings, or family fractures. They were just present in their own simple lives. And for the first time, I didn't feel separate from that idea. I pushed the door open and walked in. The sound of the bell above the door rang softly. The barista looked up and smiled politely. "Coffee?" he asked. I paused for a second, then nodded. Yes, just coffee, simple words, but they felt unfamiliar, like I hadn't used them in a long time without emotional weight attached. I sat near the window. The cup arrived a few minutes later. Warm. Steaming, ordinary. I wrapped my hands around it, not because I needed warmth, but because I needed something real to hold onto in a moment that felt strangely unfamiliar. And as I sat there, I realized something else. For so long, I had been defined by what was happening to me. A father, a husband, a name in legal documents, a person inside someone else's conflict. But sitting here now, I wasn't any of those things. I was just me, and that realization didn't feel powerful. It felt quiet, almost fragile. Because when your identity has been shaped by chaos for too long, peace doesn't feel strong at first, it feels uncertain. My mind drifted again, not toward blame, not toward analysis, but toward understanding. Melissa hadn't been a villain in the way stories like this often make people seem. Neither had Ethan, neither had even Richard Hale. They were people who had been pulled into a chain of belief, assumption, influence, and misinterpretation. And somewhere inside that chain, truth had been distorted into something it was never meant to be. I took a slow sip of coffee. Warmth spread through me, not just physically, but mentally. Because I finally understood something that had taken everything to learn. Truth doesn't always arrive clean. Sometimes it arrives after damage has already been done. And when it does, it doesn't ask for revenge, it asks for clarity. I looked outside the window again. The world hadn't changed, but my place in it had. I wasn't inside the storm anymore. I was observing what remained after it, and what remained wasn't destruction. It was continuation, life continuing even after everything. My phone buzzed once on the table. I looked at it. No urgency, no fear, just a message notification. I didn't open it immediately, and that alone surprised me. Because at one point in my life, every notification felt like a new problem waiting to happen. Now it was just information, nothing more. I let it sit there for a moment longer before finally picking it up. And as I unlocked the screen, I realized something else. For the first time, I wasn't reacting immediately. I was choosing. Choosing what mattered, choosing what deserved my attention, choosing what I allowed to enter my peace. And that was new. I leaned back in the chair slightly. Outside, the evening light was beginning to soften everything it touched. Shadows stretched longer, sounds became calmer, the world was transitioning into something slower, and I realized I was too. Not because life had become easy, but because I no longer needed it to be resolved in order to continue living. And in that moment, something inside me finally settled, not as an ending. Not as closure, but as understanding, that some stories don't end when everything is fixed. They end when you stop carrying them inside you. And that realization didn't arrive as a sudden moment of enlightenment. It came slowly, like something heavy finally being placed down after being carried for too long. I sat in that cafe for a while longer, watching the light outside shift into evening tones. The world continued moving, indifferent and steady, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. And maybe that was the most surprising part of all this, the fact that life never announces its return to normal. It just quietly becomes normal again. No warning, no ceremony, just continuation. I finished my coffee slowly, not because I was delaying anything, but because I finally understood there was nothing to rush toward anymore. For so long, every action I took had a purpose tied to resolution. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision had been connected to ending something unresolved. But now there was no end left to chase, only life. When I finally stood up, I didn't feel different in a dramatic way. There was no sudden transformation, no emotional breakthrough that changed everything at once. Instead, it felt like something inside me had simply stopped tightening. Like a rope that had been pulled too hard for too long had finally been loosened just enough to breathe again. I stepped outside. The air felt cooler now, not empty, just calm. I walked without direction for a while, letting my feet choose the pace instead of my thoughts. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't mentally preparing for what came next. I wasn't rehearsing conversations or replaying past decisions. I was just walking, present. The city around me didn't feel unfamiliar, but my perception of it had changed. I noticed details I would have normally ignored. The way streetlights flickered on one by one, the distant sound of someone laughing near a shop. The rhythm of everyday life continuing without interruption. It made me realize something simple but important. My world had not been destroyed. It had just been restructured in my understanding of it. I stopped near a crosswalk and waited for the light to change. As I stood there, I thought about Ethan. not as a part of the case anymore, not as a piece of conflict, but as my son. A son who had been pulled into something he didn't fully understand. A son who had believed he was doing the right thing. A son who would now have to rebuild his understanding of trust, not just in others, but in himself. There was no anger left when I thought of him, only distance. And distance, I realized, is sometimes the only way people can eventually find their way back to clarity. The light turned green, I crossed the street. On the other side, I stopped again. Because something unexpected had entered my mind. Not memories, not regret, but questions about what comes after closure, because nobody really talks about that part. What happens after the truth is revealed, after the conflict ends, after the system resets? You don't go back to who you were, and you don't fully become someone new either. You exist somewhere in between, a version of yourself that understands too much to return to ignorance, but has finally learned enough to stop being defined by what hurt them. I continued walking. The city lights were brighter now, the sky darker, and somewhere in that contrast I felt a quiet shift, not emotional, not dramatic, just acceptance settling deeper than before. By the time I reached home, night had fully arrived. The house looked the same from the outside, but I knew I wouldn't experience it the same way I did before. Inside, everything was quiet. No urgent calls, no legal updates, no emotional storms waiting behind the door, just space. I stood in the living room for a moment without moving, letting the silence exist without trying to interpret it. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something restored. I walked slowly through the house, not searching for anything but simply acknowledging what remained. Life. Normal, quiet, uninterrupted life. I sat down near the window, looking outside at the night. And that's when the final understanding finally arrived, not as a thought, but as a feeling that didn't need words to explain itself. What I had gone through wasn't just a conflict. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't even just truth being revealed. It was a stripping away of assumptions, of emotional noise, of illusions about control. And what remained was not broken, it was just real. And reality, I realized, doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like stillness. Sometimes it feels like nothing has changed on the outside, but everything has changed within. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. No more preparing, no more waiting. No more carrying stories that no longer needed to be carried. And in that quiet moment, I understood something I will never forget. Peace is not something you find after the storm ends. It is what appears when you finally stop standing inside the storm in your mind. When I opened my eyes again, the world outside was still the same. But I was, not because I had become stronger. Not because I had become wiser, but because I had finally stopped needing the story to continue. And in that release, I found something I never expected, not happiness, not revenge, not even closure. Just freedom, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply exists when you are no longer fighting to be someone inside a story that has already ended. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't surviving my life anymore. I was living it. That sentence didn't feel like an ending when I said it in my mind. It felt like a beginning I didn't fully understand yet. Because survival has a rhythm to it. You wake up already preparing for impact. You speak carefully, not because you want to, but because you're protecting yourself from what might come back at you. Even silence feels like a strategy. Even peace feels temporary, like something that could break at any second. But living is different. Living doesn't ask you to stay ready for war. It asks you to stay present for life. I stood there for a while longer outside my home, not rushing inside, not avoiding anything. Just existing in that in-between space where the past no longer pulls you back, and the future hasn't started demanding anything yet. It was strange how unfamiliar that felt. For so long, my identity had been shaped by pressure. Even when things were calm, my mind never truly believed in calm. There was always something behind it, something hidden, something waiting, something that would eventually surface and demand attention again. But now there was nothing waiting, no hidden file. No unexpected call, no emotional confrontation disguised as conversation, just silence that wasn't threatening anymore. I finally stepped inside. The door closed behind me softly, and for the first time that sound didn't feel like the closing of a chapter under tension. It just felt like a door closing, nothing more. The house was the same, but my experience of it was. I noticed details I had stopped noticing months ago. The faint light reflection on the wall, the stillness of the furniture. The quiet hum of the environment that had always been there but never truly heard. I walked slowly through each room, not searching for anything, not checking anything, just moving through a space that belonged to me again without conflict attached to it. And somewhere in that quiet movement, I realized something important. Peace doesn't always feel like happiness. Sometimes it feels like unfamiliar emptiness at first. Because when your mind has been trained for chaos, calm doesn't immediately feel safe. It feels incomplete, like something is missing, but slowly that feeling begins to change. Not because the outside world changes, but because you stop expecting it to collapse. I sat down near the window again, the same place where so many thoughts had once felt heavy and unresolved. But now the same view outside didn't feel like a reminder of everything that had happened. It just looked like evening, a normal one, a continuing one. And that was when I understood something I hadn't understood before. Healing is not loud, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't prove itself, it simply replaces reaction with awareness. Memory with acceptance, tension with breath. I leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath I didn't even realize I had been holding for so long, and in that breath I felt it clearly, not victory. Not defeat, not closure in the dramatic sense people expect from stories like this, but something quieter, something deeper, the absence of weight. Because the story I had been living inside, full of betrayal, truth, confrontation, and revelation, had finally stopped speaking. And in its silence, I could finally hear something else again. My own life, not the version defined by conflict, not the version shaped by what others did or didn't do, but the simple, unfiltered reality of existing without resistance. I stood up once more not because anything demanded it, but because I wanted to, and that single difference meant everything. As I walked through the house, I didn't feel like someone recovering from a storm anymore. I felt like someone rediscovering what a normal day feels like. And maybe that is what all of this had been leading to, not revenge, not justice, not even understanding others, but returning to myself. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was surviving my life anymore. I was living it, and this time I didn't fear what came next. I simply met it. But for a long time after that moment, I didn't move. Not because I was stuck, but because I finally understood something most people spend their entire lives running from. Not every ending feels like an ending. Some endings feel like silence. And silence is where truth finally stops shouting and starts breathing. I stood there in that quiet space of my own life, and I realized something strange. Everything I had been through, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, the emotional breakdowns, the revelations I never saw coming, none of it had actually disappeared. It had simply stopped controlling me. The memories were still there, but they no longer dictated how I felt about myself. That was the real shift, not what happened, but what it no longer meant. For so long, I thought healing would feel like victory, like standing over everything that hurt me and proving I was stronger. But that wasn't it at all. Healing felt like distance. Like slowly stepping back from something that once felt like the entire world until it became just a part of your past. I walked again, not fast, not slow, just naturally. And every step felt lighter than the last. Not because the weight was gone, but because I had finally stopped carrying it in my hands. There's a difference between pain disappearing and pain losing its authority over you. And I had crossed that line without even noticing when it happened. The world around me looked the same. But I didn't. People passed by me, living their own lives, carrying their own battles, their own hidden stories no one would ever fully understand. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was separate from them. I felt connected again, not through pain, not through conflict, but through something simpler, existence. I stopped near a quiet street as the wind passed through, and I realized something that made me pause longer than expected. For months, maybe even years, I had been waiting for something to end so I could start living again. But life doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't pause for closure. It continues. And at some point, you either step back into it or you stay trapped inside what already ended. I chose to step back in, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like someone finally opening a door they had been standing in front of for too long. And when I did, nothing outside had changed, but everything inside had. Because now I understood something deeply important. I wasn't the same person who entered that storm, and I wasn't supposed to be. People often think they want their old life back after everything falls apart. But the truth is, you don't go back, you evolve, or you stay stuck. And I had finally chosen to move forward. Not because everything made sense, but because I no longer needed it to. The answers had already done their job. They had revealed what needed to be revealed, and now they could finally be released. I looked up at the sky as evening settled in. The colors weren't extraordinary. There was no dramatic symbolism, just a normal sky that suddenly felt enough. And in that moment, I understood something I will never forget. Peace is not something you find after everything is fixed. Peace is what appears when you stop demanding that life explains itself before you continue living it. I took one final breath. Slow, deep, real. And for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next chapter of my life to begin. I felt like I was already inside it. If you've watched this far, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never just about betrayal. It was never just about family conflict or hidden truths. It was about something much deeper. The moment a person stops surviving and starts living again. Because in the end, life doesn't always give you justice the way you expect it. But it always gives you clarity when you're finally ready to see it. And sometimes, that clarity is the only closure you were ever meant to have. If this story stayed with you, make sure you subscribe. Because every story on this channel is another journey into hidden truths, emotional betrayal, and the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't destroy others, but transforms the one who survives it. Like the video if you felt the story and comment below what part hit you the hardest. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay aware, stay grounded. And remember, sometimes the loudest ending is the one where you finally stop fighting and start living.